Look at this photograph. Four people standing outdoors. Early 1900s based on the clothing and photographic quality. Three women and one man arranged in a line beneath large trees. Let me describe what we're seeing. The man stands second from the left. He's wearing a dark suit, vest, jacket, tie, a bowler hat. His posture is upright, confident. To his left, a woman in a tan or beige dress with dark trim, large hat. She's holding what appears to be gloves. To his right, another woman, light-colored blouse, long dark skirt, an elaborate hat with decorative elements. And on the far right, a third woman, white blouse, dark skirt, another large, ornate hat. Behind them, bare trees suggest late fall or early spring. The ground is covered with dry leaves and sparse grass. This is clearly a formal photograph, not a casual snapshot. Everyone is dressed carefully, positioned deliberately. The kind of photograph you take to mark something, a gathering, an occasion, a relationship. And that last word matters, because when this photograph appears in historical archives, it's often labeled with one simple descriptor: family group, or relatives at courthouse. Clean, neutral, safe. But look at the photograph again. Does it match that label? In the early 1900s, formal outdoor photographs like this one had specific purposes. They documented relationships, family gatherings, engagements, marriages, business partnerships. Photography was expensive enough that you didn't waste it on random groupings. If four people stood together for a photograph, it meant something. The question is, what? Family photographs from this era followed conventions. Parents stood in the center or back, children arranged by age, spouses positioned next to each other. There was a visual grammar to these images, understood codes about who stood where and why. But this photograph doesn't quite follow those conventions, and that's the first sign something is off. But let's talk about how historical archives categorize photographs like this. When images are donated to libraries, historical societies, or museum collections, archivists create metadata. They record approximate date, location if known, subjects depicted, and relationships between subjects if documented. That last category is crucial. Archives rely on whatever information came with the photograph: a handwritten note on the back, a family member's recollection, census records that might match the people and date. But here's the problem. Archives in the early to mid-1900s were deeply conservative institutions. They had strict ideas about what kinds of relationships were acceptable to document. Family, yes. Business associates, yes. Church groups, yes. Anything outside those categories? It got sanitized, relabeled, made to fit acceptable frameworks. There's a specific vocabulary archives used when relationships didn't fit standard categories. Companions, close friends, relatives, even when they weren't, household members. These were code words, deliberately vague labels that could mean almost anything, and therefore meant nothing specific. They allowed archives to file photographs without acknowledging relationships that might be controversial. This wasn't accidental. Archival classification systems reflected social norms, and social norms in the early to mid-1900s were rigid about what kinds of relationships could be publicly acknowledged. Anything that suggested intimacy outside of marriage? Erased. Anything that suggested non-traditional family structures? Sanitized. Anything that couldn't be easily explained? Labeled vaguely and moved along. The result is an archive full of photographs labeled relatives or friends that tell much more complex stories if you know how to read them. Let's return to this specific photograph. Look at how the four people are positioned. The man stands in the center left, not quite in the middle, but prominent. The woman to his immediate right, the one in the light blouse, is standing very close to him, not touching, but closer than the others. Her posture leans slightly in his direction. The woman on the far right stands at a noticeable distance, more formal, more separate. And the woman on the far left, also close to the man, but her body language is different, more parallel, less engaged. If this were a standard family photograph from this era, you'd expect a married couple in the center, children or relatives flanking them, even spacing, clear hierarchical arrangement. But that's not what we're seeing. The spacing is uneven. The focus seems distributed. And the woman standing closest to the man doesn't have the body language of a sister or cousin. She has the body language of someone who matters to him differently.
This photograph exists in at least one archival collection. It's labeled Group at Courthouse. Location, Appalachia, likely Virginia or Kentucky. Date, estimated 1900-1915. Subjects, listed as unidentified individuals, or in some versions, family group. That's it. No names, no specific relationships, no context. Just people near a courthouse. But here's what's missing. Why were they at a courthouse? Was this a legal proceeding? A marriage? A land transaction? And more importantly, what were their actual relationships to each other? The archive doesn't say, can't say, or won't say. Courthouses in rural America served multiple functions in the early 1900s. They were sites of marriage licenses, property transfers, legal disputes, probate hearings, divorce proceedings. Being photographed at a courthouse meant you were there for something official, something that required documentation. But here's the complexity. Not everything that happened at courthouses made it into public records. Some transactions were filed but later sealed. Some relationships were documented minimally, just enough to be legal, not enough to be traceable. And some arrangements existed in legal gray areas. Common law marriages, domestic partnerships that weren't formally recognized, blended families created by death, remarriage, or circumstance. The courthouse might have a record, but that record might be vague, incomplete, or deliberately obscured. There are multiple ways to interpret this photograph. Let me offer several, without claiming any one is definitive. Possibility 1, polygamous or non-monogamous arrangement. In some rural communities in the early 1900s, informal polygamy existed, not legally recognized, but socially tolerated in certain contexts. One man, multiple women in a household structure that didn't fit official categories. Possibility 2, blended family after death or separation. The man could be a widower who remarried, with grown daughters from a previous marriage and a new wife. The spacing could reflect complicated family dynamics. Possibility 3, economic or caretaking arrangement. In rural areas, households sometimes included women who weren't wives or relatives, housekeepers, hired help, or women in economic partnerships that had social complexity. Possibility 4, romantic relationships that couldn't be publicly acknowledged, extramarital relationships, same-sex partnerships presenting as cousins, or other arrangements that required public discretion. The point isn't to determine which is true. The point is that the archive's label, relatives, forecloses all of this complexity. It imposes a sanitized category onto something that might have been much messier, more interesting, more human.
But here's what makes photographs dangerous to official narratives. They capture things that weren't supposed to be visible. A census record might list 3 women as sister, wife, and boarder. Clean, categorized, acceptable. But then you find the photograph, and the way they're standing doesn't match those labels. The intimacy is distributed differently than the official record suggests. Someone who's listed as boarder is standing closer to the man than the person listed as wife. Someone who's supposedly a sister has body language that reads as something else entirely. Photographs leak information that paperwork tries to contain. And archives, when they notice this, tend to respond by becoming vaguer. If the photo contradicts the record, remove the specific labels. Just call them relatives or group and file it away. Problem solved. Except the photograph remains, and it keeps telling its own story. Look at what they're wearing. All 4 people are dressed formally. This isn't everyday clothing. The women's hats alone indicate significant expense and care. Large, decorated hats like these were statements. They required money, access to milliners, social awareness of fashion. The man's suit is well-fitted, professional. This is a group of people who had resources, who cared about presentation, who understood they were being photographed for a reason. But here's what's interesting. The 3 women aren't dressed identically, but they're dressed similarly. Not like a mother and daughters where you'd expect generational differences in style. More like peers, women of roughly the same age and social standing. That complicates the family group narrative. If these were sisters and a brother, you'd expect more variation. If this were a man with his wife and mother, the generational difference would show in the clothing. But instead, we have 3 women dressed as near equals, all arranged around one man, which suggests a relationship structure that doesn't fit standard family models. At this point, you might want a definitive answer. Who were these people? What was their actual relationship? I can't give you that, because the records that would answer those questions either don't exist, were never created, or were deliberately obscured. What we have is one photograph, a vague archive label, clothing and spacing that suggest complexity, and a courthouse location that implies legal documentation existed at some point. But connecting those pieces definitively, impossible. And that impossibility is the point. Archives preserved just enough to file the photograph, not enough to understand it.
In historical research, there's a concept called archival silence. It refers to what's missing from records, not because it was lost, but because it was never written down in the first place. Certain relationships were documented minimally or not at all. Certain living arrangements were tolerated socially, but never formalized legally. Certain intimacies existed in spaces that official paperwork couldn't or wouldn't acknowledge. And the result is silence. Not absence. These people existed. These relationships were real. But silence in the archive. No marriage record, even though they lived as spouses. No legal partnership, even though they shared property. No documentation of the actual structure of their household, because it didn't fit the forms. This photograph exists in that silence. It shows people whose relationships mattered enough to photograph, but not enough, or not in the right way, to document clearly. 4 people, dressed formally, standing near a courthouse. The archive calls them relatives, but look at the spacing. Look at who stands close to whom. Look at the body language, the attention, the arrangement. Does relatives capture what you're seeing? Or does it flatten something more complex into something simpler, something easier to file? The photograph hasn't changed, but what it means depends on what questions you're willing to ask and what answers you're willing to accept as incomplete. When archives use vague labels, they're not neutral. They're making choices about what to preserve and what to obscure. Calling this group relatives or unidentified individuals erases the specificity of their relationships. It makes them generic, interchangeable with any other group photograph from the era. And it ensures that future researchers can't trace what actually connected these people, can't understand the household they formed, can't acknowledge the relationships they actually had. The vagueness protects the archive's comfort, but it erases the people's reality. This is the 4th photograph in this series. Each one shows people who were documented, but not truthfully, not completely, not in ways that honored the complexity of their lives. The first showed someone who fell out of census records. The second showed children used as evidence. The third showed people cataloged as specimens. This one showed people whose relationships were sanitized by the archive. Different mechanisms, same result. People reduced to categories that didn't fit them, lives flattened into labels that hid more than they revealed. I can't tell you who these people were. I can't tell you the exact nature of their relationships. I can't tell you why they were at the courthouse that day. I can't tell you whether they chose to be vague in how they presented themselves, or whether the vagueness was imposed later by archivists. What I can tell you is this: the photograph shows something. The archive hides it. And that hiding wasn't neutral. It was a choice to preserve the image while erasing the meaning. 4 people, 1 courthouse, 0 honest labels. The photograph survived. The relationships did not. Not because they ended, but because the archive refused to see them. What wasn't written mattered more than what was. And what was written, relatives, group, unidentified, was designed to make you stop looking. Next time, another photograph, another system, another way of being seen, but never understood.